Thank you all so much for joining me today. We're going to take just a few minutes and work our way around the Zoom, introducing ourselves, and then we will introduce our topic. So my name is Dr. Katie Dawson. I am the Assistant Vice President for Academic Innovation and Learning at the UL system. And I have the privilege of working with these three wonderful colleagues of mine who shared their expertise all the time. And so I'm excited to include them in this conversation. Elizabeth, will you introduce yourself next?
Sure. I am Dr. Elizabeth Robertson Hornsby. I am currently serving as the content expert for online teaching and learning for the UL system. But my day job is an assistant professor and graduate coordinator in the Department of Communication and Media Studies at Southeastern Louisiana University. I'm excited for this conversation. I've been looking forward to it since we planned it.
Rebecca, would you like to go to next?
Sure. My name is Rebecca Kelly. I am the Digital Inclusion and E-Learning Program Manager with LOUIS, which is the Louisiana Library Network, which is a program of the Louisiana Board of Regents. And I'm also excited to be included in this conversation. Thank you, Katie, for inviting me to join you guys to talk about this important topic.
I'm Dr. Megan Lowe. I'm the Director of University Libraries at Northwestern State. I am also the content expert for open education resources for the UL system. Digital literacy is connected to information literacy, and as a former instructional librarian, it's near and dear to my heart. And I think all of my colleagues will agree that anything that centers on learning in the digital space requires a digital literacy that is dangerous for us to assume about our incoming students, as well as our colleagues in the classroom. I think the pandemic taught us something that we should have been mindful of before, but really underline what our assumptions about digital literacy were across the board, not just students, but higher education personnel as well.
And what a good segue into our topic. So today we were going to have a discussion about the digital divide, digital literacy, and digital skills. And so let's flashback, maybe not too far for too long, to March of 2020, when our institutions were given the directive to shift to a mass online remote instruction environment. I got to be honest, guys. I didn't realize how massive the digital divide continued to be in 2020 and what it continues to be today. It kind of blew my mind when we made that shift. We lost faculty, we lost staff, we lost students. We didn't know where they were. We didn't know why they weren't interacting with us in the online environment. And so I spent the better part of the last few years really studying what does the digital divide look like in Louisiana. And so one of the resources on our resource page is a website that my research partner, Rachel Lotiger Bodwin, and I put together that gives a visual depiction to what the digital divide looks like in Louisiana. And I was really astounded by those results. Absolutely, geographically, internet is not necessarily a commodity or utility that's widely available. When you look at, Megan, as an example, Northwestern's campus, less than 2 miles from Northwestern's campus, there is a zip code where less than 10% of the population has access to internet, and they're 2 miles from our campuses. And so to start off this discussion about the digital divide, I'd like to know what were your perceptions of it? How have you seen it exacerbated over the last few years? And what steps do you think that we can take collectively to help bridge that digital divide?
since you called out my area of the state, it's worth noting that I have a colleague, a work colleague, who lives about 15 minutes from campus, has a stable job, stable income, college educated, and despite all of that, cannot get stable broadband access internet. So it's interesting to note where the deficits are and why they occur. Over the last few years, I think we have seen a challenging of our assumptions in higher ed. I think there have been assumptions around if students want to be here, then they have the resources to be here, which is a gross generalization. I think we've also assumed that they have the motivation and the knowledge to navigate what it means to be a college student in this day and age, because even prior to the pandemic, hybrid classes and asynchronous online classes and asynchronous online learning were a thing. And I think for us to sort of zoom in on the pandemic as the sort of start of that is a mistake, is to forget what higher education's looked like and how it's evolved. So what I have seen from within the library, because I think the library winds up being very, very conscious of the limitations of its users for a variety of reasons, is those assumptions about what students have access to and what they can do, both on the part of administration and on the part of classroom faculty. And I think we really need to challenge ourselves to question those assumptions, because there are a lot of students who want to do this, who want to get college degrees. And when they get here, they are immediately overwhelmed by technology, immediately. And there's this idea that the digital native is therefore digitally literate. And that's not the case. I like to use the analogy that I grew up around cars, I drive a car, I own a car, I know all of these things about cars. But if you were to ask me to fix my own car, we would all be out of luck. I can barely change a tire. So I think you have to look at that and then look at our digital natives and go, just because technology is ubiquitous and because they use it every day, those skills do not translate to the online learning environment. And so to assume that everybody in this day and age has access to devices, everybody in this day and age has access to stable internet is dangerous. And I think it means that there wind up being gaps in our policies in higher education institutions, and there wind up being gaps in our practices that really cause us to lose those students. And I don't think we can afford to do that if we're going to be pragmatic. But I think too, when we only apply those assumptions to our students and we ignore our employees as well, we're also doing them a disservice. I was one of the last people to leave campus in March of 2020. And I knew from my colleagues in the unit in which I operated that a lot of them were staff, they weren't faculty, and a lot of them didn't have computers at home. And so they literally had to take their desktops out of their offices and take them home. And I think there was an assumption on the part of the institution that all these people had laptops. That was dangerous. And then a lot of them had to be provided with hotspots, because a lot of these people didn't have internet at home. They lived in very rural areas. And for clarification, my previous institution was the University of Louisiana at Monroe. And you think of Monroe as sort of metropolitan, but a lot of our employees live in the surrounding rural areas where internet wasn't stable. So they had to have those hotspots or they were out of luck. I think the institution itself got a lot of that COVID technology, the hotspots, the laptops, thinking that they would have to provide them to the students. And what wound up happening is that a lot of that had to go to staff as well, just to do their jobs. It's not just about what we do in the classroom, but it's about what goes on also behind the scenes to keep an institution running. And if we can't keep the registrar running from home, if we can't keep the financial aid people running from home, then we can't run this institution. A lot of moving parts. And I think that those assumptions were deeply challenged, and they needed to be. And I'm glad that they were, but we haven't seen as many solutions post-pandemic as I thought we were. I haven't seen I haven't seen a lot of people continue to be mindful of these deficits. That there's this idea that we're all back on campus, everything is back to normal, so these deficits must no longer occur. No, they occurred before the pandemic, just shone a light on it in a way that we couldn't ignore. They didn't go away any more than I believe COVID has fully gone away. And so we really need to be moving forward mindful of these assumptions around access to technology and people's capability to navigate that. We were already dealing with that in libraries, remote access to databases from off campus. Oh, you can just do it at any time. The building doesn't have to be open 24/7. Not so, says the student who works 9 to 5 and does need the library after 5 o'clock because they don't have a computer at home. They don't have internet at home. How are they supposed to do their coursework? How are they supposed to access the databases if those are not things that they can do remotely?
Elizabeth, do you want to talk about your experience with the digital divide?
Sure. I think Megan said something really interesting that I want to go back to. I mean, I've been teaching online officially since 2008. So fairly early into my teaching career, I shifted to online teaching just in part because my life shifted and online instruction kind of better fit where I was going professionally and personally. And so at that time, there weren't what we see now in terms of robust, like there was no online program or hub. You just kind of did it and figured it out. And maybe there was a professional development here and there. And so I think in some ways, for those of us who had been teaching online before March 2020, we kind of had an idea about the disparity between those who have access to internet, those who understand technology, because what I would find, you know, in teaching from 2008 to, I guess, 2020, in that 12-year span, is that a lot of students needed to take class online because of their lives, because of their work, because of their, you know, family situations or whatnot. But a lot of them didn't have the resources or the skills to actually be efficient and productive online students, because those weren't literacies that were embedded in their not K through 12 experience, obviously, and definitely not in their any sort of college experience that they had before becoming an online student. And so I think for me, fairly early on, I didn't have the knowledge and the frameworks and the words to know that this was digital divide and digital equity. Like, we weren't really talking that. It was just like, hey, I need to take this online class because I work offshore, or I need to take this online class because I'm a stay-at-home mom, or I need to take this online class because I do shift work during the day. But I don't have access to a computer, and I'm on my phone when you know, smartphones became a thing that more people kind of had, or, you know, I'd have to go to the public library or the library on my campus to do all of my work. And that's part of the reason that I pushed so hard for asynchronous classes, because that was part of that, was sort of acknowledging that people need to be able to do this work when they have access to the devices and hardware and internet to be able to do it. And that might not fit between a 9 to 5 or a 7 to 5 schedule. It may be midnight. It may be, you know, in the wee hours of the morning where they can drive to someone's house who has a computer and have internet. Like, those were the early conversations I was having. And then also, there was a spectrum of ages in my classes. And so I had students who were digitally native, if that's a thing. I would say more accurately digitally immersed, not necessarily digitally native, but to older students who didn't have a college in their education, didn't have the internet or a computer in their educational experiences early on. And so just having them navigate the internet in general, whatever the internet looked at like at those varying stages, that was very much a thing. And so I say all that to say, I think that by the time 2020 rolled around, I was already teaching predominantly 100% online async, but my colleagues weren't. And so I felt the responsibility, because I knew how hard in that 12 years of getting being able to be sort of agile in a technology enhanced environment. It took me a long time to do that. And now my colleagues who had not really had to do that, were very much physical presence based, had days, weeks to essentially, I think maybe it was a week or 2 weeks. They like kind of gave us, I can't remember, but it wasn't a long time to shift completely, not only their instruction to the students, but how they worked. And so I myself and the other folks in my department who had experienced teaching online really felt a responsibility to help those. And we saw the same things that Megan was saying, like people didn't have laptops in their home. Some of them had actively made decisions that work stays at work. I'm not going to have a work laptop at my house. I'm not going to have high-speed internet at my house because I want work to stay at work. Well, what happens when work has to come home because it's not an option to do anything else? And so, yeah, we found the same thing. A lot of the hotspots were going to faculty, and there was a great need for stable internet. There was a great need for devices. And then people were also realizing how high bandwidth their course materials were, how high bandwidth their instruction was, and the sort of burden that placed on students who didn't have access to that technology to be able to interact with the material. So I think it was eye-opening in a way. And I don't have answers, and hopefully I know we're going to get to that, but it definitely, I was grateful for my 12 years leading up to it. I think that I was able to navigate that turn probably more efficiently than some others, but also seeing just how far we haven't come in the 12 years I had been doing this, and the fact that at a systemic level and then at the institution level, a lot of things were assumed but never addressed. And then sort of it was disheartening because we had a lot of focus on that in 2020, in 2021. We had a lot of industry and organizations really stepping up and providing materials and resources and hardware and, discounted or free access to things that would help sort of bridge that gap, that when everything sort of returned back to normal, it really did just go back, and all of that momentum slowed to a certain extent. And so that's kind of my thoughts on that.
No, I appreciate that. I especially appreciate the comment about assumptions. I think that has been the biggest takeaway for me, is that we can't make assumptions about what students have or don't have, what kind of internet access they have or they don't have, what kind of digital literacy skills they have or do not have. So one of the populations that I'm so excited to work with are adults who are looking to return and finish a degree. So they potentially got sidetracked for any number of reasons, but now they're ready to return. Well, for most adult students, an online program is going to be the best way for them to fulfill their degree requirements. They're working full-time jobs. They have community and family responsibilities. They don't necessarily have the time to make it to a campus, even if they live within 10 to 15 miles of that campus. And so as we're serving these adult students, I keep coming back to what resources do we have in place? And I'm not just talking about hardware resources available to students, though that is helpful for sure, but I'm also thinking about the skills that we're embedding in our classes and where we're embedding those skills, because the answer isn't just to put it in an orientation, right? Because if you have a student who's earned 75 hours somewhere else and they're transferring to your institution, chances are they don't need that university experience class. And so how are we thinking about addressing these not only at those lower level undergraduate courses where we might accommodate the assumption that skills are not at an expert level? How are we embedding that into upper level courses, graduate level courses, research courses? For a lot of the students that we're serving, they did their research in the library, and now they're having to use databases online. And what does that look like? So Rebecca, in your work with librarians across the state, what has the state of flux looked like? And how are you working with those librarians to help address those needs?
Well, that's a really good question. Before I answer that, I did want to kind of just address the earlier question about, my assumptions that I had, leading up to when, 2020 happened and we all got sent home, having had I've been an academic librarian for over 10 years, and I was very well versed in the digital divide, thinking about how libraries, both academic and public libraries, provide access to the internet for people that don't have it, and access to a computer for people that don't. And we had computer labs full of students at my previous institution. And so I always knew there was this assumption by some people that everyone had a computer and everyone had access to the internet. But where I had an assumption that I didn't recognize until 2020 was this digital skills gap. Like, I didn't realize that that was such a big thing until we started hearing stories about, students not being able to do certain types of things online when their classes moved online and they had not taken online classes before, or especially professors, like teaching faculty, that didn't know how to move their class online because they had still had their students turning in physical papers, and they weren't taking advantage of learning management systems. And so I took on this new role with the Board of Regents in April of last year, and have been running a pilot in some of our public libraries, specifically focused on this digital skills gap. And we are implementing a program called North Star Digital Literacy in those public libraries to see if we can figure out a way to address that digital skills gap across the state with some of our more vulnerable populations, people that have been left behind in a way during the last few decades, really. And back in 2020, the Board of Regents installed a task force to look into this issue. And they really started out, and I wasn't there at the time, but I know a little bit of the history. And they started out looking into this to address this quick movement of all the classes online, to try to provide support for the faculty, looking at like where those gaps were, both for the faculty and for students. And that was when Lewis and the Board of Regents really realized that this digital skills divide was there as well. And so North Star has been provided to as a resource, an online digital tool to all of our institutions. Not everyone has implemented it. Not everyone's taken advantage of it. We've paid for it for everyone. But it does address the foundational digital skills that that our students and our staff, because it is open for staff to take these assessments, their practice lessons. So we're really excited to see like how that might be embedded in the courses through, as you talked about, Katie, not just in orientation, because we do know it's being used in that way, but also how can we embed that type of assessment of people's digital skills to see where they are and see where those gaps are, so that we can potentially address that in the classroom, provide resources to our students to meet them where they are, to help them be more successful in their class.
It's another area for assumptions as well. You made the comment that, oh, these are being embedded in upper level classes and in graduate level classes, and that's not always the case. I was at my previous institution for a number of years, the liaison to the marriage and family therapy program, and that is a master's and doctoral level program. And so one of the professors in that department would have me come in on second or third day of class for his research methods class. And I would come in and I would talk about what the library had in terms of services, what the library had in terms of specific databases and resources that would specifically support the type of research that they were being expected to do as master's level or doctoral level students. And the thing that I heard again and again consistently was, why didn't I get this kind of support as an undergrad? And these are people who have made it into grad school. These are people who have made it into a doctoral program. These are very self-motivated students. Or at least they've endured. They have endured and have made it through. And yet they're saying, I never formally got this kind of instruction. I never had this kind of thing. And I never cringed harder than hearing a senior say to me, oh yeah, I've made it through my whole undergraduate career and have never set foot in the library. So there's an assumption that students are getting these information literacy skills or these digital literacy skills as undergrads. As Elizabeth noted earlier, they're not getting it in K through 12. And I think a lot of faculty who do not teach those gen ed courses or who do not teach lower level courses anymore make assumptions about what their students are getting in those lower levels. And we all know too that students will often come in with credit and they can bypass those introductory level courses. And so they may be bypassing where they would get that exposure. And let's face it, the core curriculum is jam-packed, and with some majors, it's more jam-packed. There's not a lot of space in there for those students to access these resources when they're off of formal, whether that means through something like North Star, or if the library itself is offering open workshops. And so I think that that's another place. We need people to stop assuming that our students are getting this. But I think too, it would be important to articulate our expectations to our students as well. If you don't have these skills, here's how you can seek out to compensate or to address those deficits in your skill set. Because these students don't know what they don't know. They don't know coming into an asynchronous online learning class that they may have to figure out how to navigate Microsoft Word or figure out how to navigate the LMS. And all of us are clearly somewhat digitally literate here, but that doesn't mean that we don't struggle with our softwares. It doesn't mean that we don't struggle with new things that come across our feed, so to speak. And so I think expectations are helpful. Expectations are useful. And I'm saying expectations, specifically rejecting the notion of a rubric, because I think that that is a dangerous thing to try to quantify some of these skills. Because how do you quantify teaching somebody to be mindful of bias? How do you qualify teaching somebody how to look at resources on a results list to determine whether or not something is highly relevant to them? You know, results may be listed as in terms of relevance, but relevance there means your keyword shows up a whole bunch. It doesn't mean that textually or content-wise that's actually relevant to what you're doing. How do you qualify that? How do you teach that? And that's really difficult. But if we can articulate expectations, then students can go, you know, I don't know how to do that. The library in North Star can help me learn how to do that. Or I'm going to talk to my faculty member and say, hey, I don't know how to navigate this software. What would you recommend? Or can you help me navigate it a little better?
So I think that's an interesting point. And maybe our audience is very familiar with all of these skills, and maybe we could shed a little bit more light when we talk about digital skills, what we mean. So we very clearly referenced so far in this conversation, skills to use hardware and software, how to turn on a computer, how to navigate to a word processing program, how to compose and send an email, how to troubleshoot when your Wi-Fi connection is not connecting. Those are all skills that they have to be able to actually use the machine to make the machine do any of the things. So before you can even get to that content learning, you have to have the skills to be able to get to the content. Then, Megan, as you so aptly put, there's that literacy piece of it. So once you do have access to this software, once you are live on the internet, how do you determine what's a good source, what's not a good source, what has credibility, what does not have credibility? Elizabeth, how do you navigate that in the courses that you teach?
That is the question of the day. I think if anyone has the answer to it, they will be the next Nobel Peace Prize winner. Because perception of what is credible has shifted. I think in the last few years for sure. And I don't like to use buzzwords because I feel like we don't define them and then we use them and then we're replicating the sort of perceptual definition that is not actual reality. But, the pervasiveness of conversations around fake news and misinformation and disinformation that I think are oftentimes divorced or separated from what that actually is, makes it difficult to talk about credibility, because now credibility has become extremely subjective. This source is credible to me. And a lot of times that's based on experience and not necessarily the things that we know as educators and librarians are based on support and justification and sourcing and citation. Now, all of those things in some ways are looked at as less credible. And my experience, my anecdotal experience as a human in this world, is the driving force of how I perceive something as credible. And in a classroom, that is very difficult to navigate because you want to acknowledge that experience does play a part in how you interact, behave, and exist in the world. And it very much informs your worldview or your perspective. That said, there are also foundational things that have research behind them, that have I think about this in speech because I taught speech for several decades. Public speaking is what I cut my teeth on in education. And so we always have your main points and your supporting points. And I tell students a lot of times, you haven't gone past the main point. You haven't given me any supporting evidence to justify the statement. And that supporting evidence, as we teach in speech, can be a lot of different things. And sometimes it is experiential. Sometimes it is your narrative. But if you want it to be credible to a wider audience than just the people that look like you, you've got to bring in other sources to prove that credibility. And so I think what has become difficult is that the shifting line of what credible is, the shifting line of what truth is, alternative facts, when that came into the lexicon, and we joke about it, but in some ways that has wholly been embraced. Like, this is a fact, but this is my sort of oppositional view on that fact. That is now a fact in the qualifying statement that we never add on is it's a fact to me. And the fact that it's a fact to me, I want it to be a fact to you as well. But I'm not going to give you any sort of support or ethos in sort of grounding that fact in anything. It's just a fact to me. And again, if you've ever been in a public speaking classroom, people deeply believe the things that they believe. Especially by the time they get to us in a college classroom, those things have become truths to them. So and it's very difficult to break through that. So I think credibility is a conversation we have to have, but we can't just have it at a scholarly level. We have to have it at a sociocultural and a socio-psychological level, because all of those influences, we have to have it at a socio-political level, because all of those influences now are the sometimes driving narrative in our classrooms. When our students are coming in, they're coming in with these presuppositions. I remember the first time that someone had an issue with me using the internet in an online class. And that was very much driven because at the time the narrative was the internet is this terrible space and it's grooming and all of the sort of negative aspects. It's a bullying and all of that was that. And someone said, well, I can't use the internet. And I had to go to my department chair and say, what do I do? Because it's an online class. Like, the internet is a thing that has to be used. I 100% understand your moral and ethical opposition to using the internet. A lot of that is very true. But at the same time, you have to trust me as a credible enough source of instruction to know that I'm not going to intentionally expose you to harm on the internet, that any use of the internet is to achieve the goals and objectives of the course or whatever we're doing, not for all of these other purposes. And that I was like, whoa, this is a new way of navigating this space, because the sort of locus of credibility has shifted. And I think we can have a lot of conversations about a lot of things, but if we don't acknowledge that, and if we don't acknowledge that assumption that we have, that everybody thinks that these things are inherently credible and not credible, that we all come from the same place, then it's going to be a difficult road to navigate in terms of literacy, because a lot of people feel like literacy should be, I should learn what I want to learn. I should know what I want to know. I should only be exposed to the things that I want to be exposed to. And again, the qualifying statement on that is so that they support what I already believe. I don't necessarily want to be exposed to anything that's going to contradict what I inherently believe is true and credible. And as folks who work in digital literacy, that is a reality, especially now, that we have to be cognizant of, or we're going to find ourselves mired in really unproductive conversations.
I want to add something to that as a context. I started working as a professional librarian in 2002 and was an instructional librarian up until about 2018. So I was there at the time when libraries were beginning to shift into largely electronic resources. As an undergrad, I used both print and electronic, so I really did see that. But when I started working as an instructional librarian, one of the things that took me off guard for a long time, were that there were faculty members who would not let their students use the library databases, because those library databases were web-based, and they had some of those preconceived notions about the quality of information access to the internet. For them, the method, the channel, the means to the end was the problem itself. And that eventually drifted out. Eventually faculty were like, oh no, we understand now, it's great. But I think that again points to that we need to be just as careful about our assumptions as faculty members as the assumptions that we make about our students, because it's two sides of a coin. These were faculty members who understood what peer-reviewed research was. The idea that peer-reviewed research could exist on the cesspool of the internet at that time in the early 2000s boggled their mind, even though those of us who worked with it for so long knew that the origin of the internet was to support scientific study, that the internet that we know today was founded in the 1960s and was a way for scientists to share information in a quicker fashion. But even they didn't know that. So I think too, we always have to look at our context. We have to look at who we're talking to and how we're talking to them and where they're coming from too. Because for some of these people, yes, their perception is the only framework that they have. The idea of objectivity, the idea of the dangers of bias is not something that they were exposed to. And so that's the only way they can look at it. And it isn't just the institution, it is that larger context. And I think we have to bear in mind that larger context too when we're having these conversations. We have to, it's easy to be critical of faculty, it's easy to be critical of our students and how ridiculous and ignorant is that. But I think we have to stop and go, last couple of years have been a heck of a ride. People have been traumatized in different ways, and really bear that in mind, how we present these issues and how we present the solutions to these issues as well.
No, I think you make a really great point. And I think given our collective experience over the last 3 years, now's the time to act. Not only the time to address those gaping places where connectivity is not available, but also to marry not only expanding the access to internet and infrastructure, but also pairing skills and literacy building. And so Rebecca, I know that you've been working with the statewide group that's examining this problem and that is looking at ways to expand the footprint of accessibility across the state. Can you share some of the observations and some of the opportunities that are coming down the pipeline that we in higher education should be looking for and thinking about?
Yes, so with my work with the Board of Regents and this pilot that we are running in some public libraries, the whole idea behind this pilot was to come up with some statewide strategies of how we address this digital skills divide, this digital skills gap in Louisiana, with hopes of making recommendations for statewide implementation. So I don't know if all of our listeners are aware, but the infrastructure bill that was passed in 2021 included the Digital Equity Act. And there is, the state just released a couple weeks ago the draft digital equity plan. It's open for public comment through July 7th. And it is a draft, so they definitely are seeking input. So that is one place that faculty, especially that care about this issue, can contribute. But that plan explains how what Louisiana's vision is for digital equity, but especially I look at it as the areas within that. So we're looking at, affordability, how do we promote programs that make the internet affordable for people from communities that maybe are impacted by the digital divide more than others. So as far as our students go, like we're thinking about our students that come from low income households, our students who come from rural communities that don't have high-speed internet, didn't have a computer, our students of color, our students with disabilities, students with a language barrier of some sort. These are people that are impacted by this digital divide, and this digital equity plan, the state's plan has to address how we're gonna address this gap, whether it's access to the internet, affordability, access to an appropriate device. And I would argue an appropriate device is not a smartphone. It is a large screen device that is appropriate for whatever their needs are. It might not be a laptop for everyone, but maybe a tablet, something that is going to allow them to be able to use the internet to meet their needs. And that's going to be different. Our students, I would say, need a laptop or desktop, but also the skills. The plan has to address how we're going to address this digital skills gap. And there is a place for higher education in that plan. Once the plan is approved, it is going to open the gate, so to speak, for the state to apply for the state capacity, forget the full title of it, the Digital Equity Capacity Grant. Approximately, Louisiana is going to get approximately $25 million to address digital equity. That is not broadband. There's a whole nother pool of money that's going to go towards deploying broadband fiber across the state. So that's going to be addressed. And so this is supposed to be like, how are we going to reach those people that we missed, or that missed out on this the first time around, so to speak. And these are our students. I mean, if you think about the people that are disproportionately impacted by the digital divide and all aspects of the digital divide, these are our students too. They're coming from these areas where they grew up without access to the internet, without access to a computer. Their parents don't have the skills. Maybe they went to a high school that wasn't resourced enough to be able to teach those skills in the classroom. So they're coming to college and they have the ability to succeed. They need a little help with learning how to, take advantage of the technology that we have. And so I am really excited to see how this digital equity plan plays out. There are some current things that are in the draft plan right now related to higher ed and North Star digital literacy. The platform is there. There's also places for digital navigator programs, and digital navigators are people that support and help individuals one-on-one. A lot of ways like a librarian would, where you sit down and find out what their need is, Do they need to find affordable internet? Well, let me introduce you to the Affordable Connectivity Program and show you where to go and sign up. Or if you don't have a computer, let me let you know, did you know that you can check out a laptop from the library? Or did you know that there's a program in town where you can buy a low-cost refurbished device? Or it could just be, here's some tools that can help you learn the skills that you need. And so I'm excited to see how this plan plays out. It's going to give Louisiana funding over the next 5 years to address this digital divide. And I think it's our opportunity to really take advantage of it, make sure that the money is spent appropriately so that we really are addressing this issue. So yeah, I think that there is a place for higher ed there, and I hope people check it out, and I can provide the link maybe in our resources.
Thank you guys so much for joining me today for this conversation. I hope it's the first of many conversations, and I hope those of you that are watching will join in on the conversation. It's definitely just the beginning. As Rebecca just shared, there are going to be lots of opportunities over the next 5 years for us to really play a role in how digital literacy is rolled out across the state of Louisiana. And it's my firm belief that higher education institutions are the right place to house some of those resources and to help with some of that rollout, not only for our own students, faculty, and staff, but for the communities that our institutions serve. So please contact our panelists, get involved. Rebecca has a phenomenal newsletter that she sends out on a monthly basis to kind of keep you informed of all digital literacy and digital skill building efforts. So please subscribe to that. We'll put that in the resources as well. And thank you so much for joining us today.